They came east beneath the sign of the cross. Armored men, sworn brothers, guardians of pilgrims, knights of the temple. But behind the familiar story of crusader steel and sacred vows, another rumor would begin to move through the centuries, stranger, older, and far more difficult to prove. It claimed that beneath the Christian armor was a hidden inheritance from Egypt's divine past. Not gold, not relics, a bloodline, a shadowed descent from Osiris, the murdered king who would not remain dead. To understand why such a claim survived, we have to slow down. Not because the rumor is proven, it is not, but because the most powerful legends often grow in the spaces where history leaves room for longing, fear, and imagination. Picture the Eastern Mediterranean in the age of crusade. Crowded ports, desert roads, guarded shrines, languages crossing in the market air, and holy places layered over places already ancient. The Templars entered this world as soldiers of Christ, but the landscape around them carried memories far older than Christianity itself. Egypt stood nearby like a vast, half-readable book. Pyramids, temple ruins, sacred kings, gods who died and returned, stories of inheritance written not only in stone, but in the imagination of later ages. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. This is not the story of a proven Egyptian dynasty hiding inside a medieval military order. It is the story of why people wanted to believe one might exist. Chapter 2, A Legend Without a Grave. The first thing to say is the least glamorous, and probably the most important. There is no verified medieval document that proves the Knights Templar preserved an Egyptian bloodline. No charter, no confession, no surviving chronicle from the order saying that beneath their vows to the church, they served the memory of Osiris. No tomb has been opened to reveal a secret dynasty carried from the Nile into Crusader Europe. No reliable genealogy connects the warrior monks of the temple to a surviving line of Egyptian divine kings. That absence matters. In stories like this, absence can be tempting. It invites people to fill the empty space with whatever pattern seems most thrilling. A missing record becomes a suppressed record. A destroyed archive becomes a deliberate cover-up. A silence becomes a code. But careful history has to be more patient than that. The Templars were real. Their secrecy, in certain respects, was real too. They were a military religious order founded in the world of pilgrimage and crusade, bound by vows, discipline, and institutional loyalty. They moved money. They guarded roads. They held castles. They became powerful enough to inspire both admiration and resentment. When they fell, their fall was so dramatic that later generations could hardly resist turning them into something larger than they had been. Osiris was real in a different sense, not as a historical king whose descendants can be traced through parish records and noble houses, but as one of the great presences of ancient Egyptian religion. A god of death and return, a murdered ruler restored through ritual, memory, and divine order. His story carried the weight of kingship, fertility, inheritance, and survival after catastrophe. Put those two traditions side by side, and the imagination begins working before the evidence does. A secretive order of warrior monks, an ancient god whose body was broken and whose power lived on, a sacred land contested by empires, a medieval world obsessed with relics, holy descent, and divine legitimacy. Later occult writers, hungry for hidden continuities, found in this combination a kind of perfect machinery. It did not need proof in order to feel meaningful. It only needed symbols that seemed to recognize each other across time. This is where the mystery begins to reveal its true shape. The question is not simply, did the Templars carry the blood of Osiris? On the historical level, the answer is almost certainly no. Or more precisely, there is no credible evidence that they did. The more interesting question is why the claim became imaginable at all. Why would a Christian military order be linked, centuries later, to the divine mythology of Egypt? Why would Osiris, a god from a civilization already ancient when the Crusaders rode east, be made to stand behind a medieval fraternity sworn to defend Christian pilgrims? Why do modern legends so often insist that sacred truth must be biological, hidden not only in texts or rituals, but in blood? The answer lies in a long human habit, the desire to turn spiritual authority into inheritance. If a group can claim descent from something older than memory, it becomes more than an organization. It becomes a vessel, a continuation, a living thread through the ruin of empires. And few images are more powerful than the bloodline, because blood suggests that the past has not merely been remembered. It has survived physically, secretly, inside the present. That is why bloodline myths are so difficult to kill. They offer a kind of emotional solution to historical loss. Ancient Egypt fell. The temples closed. The gods were renamed, dismissed, absorbed, or forgotten. The Templars were arrested, tried, dissolved, and turned into rumor. Yet the legend whispers that nothing sacred ever truly disappears. It only changes clothing. It passes from temple to temple, from priest to knight, from symbol to symbol, waiting for someone to notice the pattern. There is beauty in that idea. There is also danger. Because once a pattern feels beautiful enough, people may stop asking whether it is true. A resemblance becomes a relationship. A shared symbol becomes a secret alliance. A later fantasy becomes an ancient tradition. And very quickly, the line between interpretation and invention begins to blur. This documentary has to walk carefully along that line. We are not here to pretend the evidence is stronger than it is. The legend of an Osirian bloodline protected by the Templars belongs mostly to the world of later speculation, occult imagination, and alternative history. It is not supported by the kind of documentation that would allow a historian to treat it as fact. But dismissing it too quickly would also miss something important. Legends are not useless simply because they are unproven. Sometimes they preserve fears, desires, and symbolic connections that formal history leaves outside the frame. A false genealogy can still tell us what later people wished were true. A myth of hidden descent can reveal how modern minds try to repair the broken chain between antiquity and the present. So the investigation begins with a grave that does not exist, not the grave of Osiris. Egyptian myth already tells us that his body was scattered, searched for, reassembled, and transformed into something beyond ordinary death, and not the grave of the Templar secret, because no such secret has been securely buried in the historical record. The grave we are looking for is stranger than both. It is the place where proof should be, but is not. Around that empty place, an entire legend has grown. Chapter 3. Osiris, the dismembered king. Long before the Templars rode beneath their red crosses, long before medieval Europe imagined secret orders hiding dangerous truths, There was another story of a sacred king whose power survived his own destruction. His name was Osiris. In ancient Egyptian religion, Osiris was not merely a god of death. That is too small a description, almost too neat. He belonged to the deep structure of Egyptian thought. Kingship, fertility, the ordered world, the promise that life could return from loss, and the hope that death was not the end of identity. The myth, in its broad shape, is one of the most haunting in the ancient world. Osiris is imagined as a rightful king, murdered through betrayal, his body broken apart, his rule violently interrupted. His wife, Isis, searches for him, gathers what has been scattered, and through devotion, magic, and divine power, restores him enough for new life to emerge. Their son, Horus, becomes the living heir, the avenger, the figure through whom kingship continues. Osiris does not return as an ordinary ruler, sitting again on an earthly throne. His restoration is stranger and more solemn than that. He becomes Lord of the Dead, a king beyond the visible kingdom, presiding over the afterlife and the hidden passage through which human beings hoped to endure. That detail matters. A simpler myth would have made Osiris victorious in the usual way. The murdered king comes back, defeats the usurper, reclaims the palace, and the story ends with order restored in public. But Osiris is not restored to the surface of the world in that manner. His power moves downward and inward. He survives by becoming the ruler of what cannot be seen. That is one reason his story became so useful to later imagination. Osiris is not just a god who dies and returns. He is a god whose authority is transformed by death. His broken body becomes a religious problem, and the answer is not denial, but reassembly. The pieces matter. The memory matters. The rites matter. Continuity is not automatic. It has to be searched for, guarded, and made whole again. This is the kind of myth that easily attracts later theories of hidden inheritance. Not because it proves any bloodline. It does not. But because the symbolism is almost magnetic. A murdered king, a scattered body, a child who carries legitimacy forward, a kingdom that survives in another realm, a promise that the sacred can be damaged without being destroyed. For ancient Egypt, this was not a puzzle to be solved by modern conspiracy. It was part of a religious universe in which kingship, cosmic order, and the afterlife were bound together. The pharaoh, in life, was associated with Horus, in death with Osiris. This did not mean every king was part of some secret biological cult in the way later fiction might imagine. It meant that rule itself was framed through divine pattern. The king stood inside a sacred drama older than any individual reign. That distinction is important, because modern readers often flatten ancient religion into a code. We look at myth and ask, what was it hiding? Ancient worshippers may have asked something closer to, what does this make possible? The Osiris story made continuity possible. It offered a way to think about death without surrendering to oblivion. It gave political power a cosmic language. It allowed the fertile Nile Valley, with its annual rhythms of loss and renewal, to be imagined through the body of a god who was cut down and yet remained necessary to life. In that sense, Osiris was not only remembered, he was repeated in ritual, repeated in royal ideology, repeated in funerary hope, repeated whenever the dead were imagined not as erased, but as transformed. And this is where we begin to understand why his shadow stretches so easily into later legends. A god like Osiris gives people a vocabulary for survival beneath catastrophe. When temples fall, when empires change language, when sacred institutions are broken, the Osirian pattern remains tempting. Perhaps what was dismembered has not disappeared. Perhaps it has only been hidden in pieces. Perhaps someone, somewhere, carries the fragment that can make the story whole again. That is a powerful religious idea. It is also the emotional engine behind many modern secret history claims. The supposed link between Osiris and the Templar borrows less from Egyptian evidence than from the emotional architecture of the Osiris myth. It borrows the feeling of interrupted kingship. It borrows the drama of a sacred body under threat. It borrows the hope that inheritance can survive in concealed form. But mythic inheritance is not the same as historical descent. The ancient Egyptians did not need a medieval order of European knights to preserve Osiris. They preserved him through texts, rituals, temple traditions, funerary practices, royal symbolism, and centuries of religious imagination. His survival was cultural and spiritual long before it became material for occult speculation. And perhaps that is the more interesting truth. Osiris endured not because one hidden family kept his blood intact, but because his story answered a fear that belongs to nearly every civilization. The fear that what is sacred can be broken beyond repair. His myth says otherwise. It says the broken thing may not return unchanged. It may not return where we expect it. It may become darker, quieter, more remote from ordinary life. But it can still rule the imagination. So when later writers looked at the Templars, an order destroyed, accused, dissolved, and never fully separated from rumor, they found in Osiris a ready-made mirror, another fallen power, another story of fragmentation, another suggestion that death might conceal continuation. The mirror is compelling, but a mirror is not a document. For now, Osiris stands where he belongs, not as the proven ancestor of a medieval brotherhood, but as the ancient symbol that made such an ancestry feel possible to those who came much later. A dismembered king, a hidden throne, a story that refused to stay buried. Chapter 4. The Sons of Osiris. In Egypt, kingship was never only politics. A pharaoh was not simply a man with a crown, a palace, an army, and a talent for appearing larger than everyone else in carved relief. He stood at the meeting point between human order and divine pattern. His authority was not meant to look merely administrative. It was meant to look cosmic. That is difficult for the modern mind to hold clearly. We tend to separate government from myth, law from ritual, the state from the sacred. Ancient Egypt did not draw those lines in the same way. The king was responsible not just for ruling territory, but for sustaining Ma'at, the principle of order, balance, truth, and right arrangement. A bad ruler did not merely mismanage a kingdom. In religious imagination, he threatened the harmony of the world. This is where Horus and Osiris become inseparable from the idea of descent. The living pharaoh was associated with Horus, the divine son who inherits, avenges, and rules. The dead pharaoh was associated with Osiris, the transformed king who passes beyond earthly life into a deeper form of sacred authority. Each reign, then, could be framed as a renewal of a divine story. Horus rises because Osiris has fallen. The son rules because the father has entered the hidden kingdom. It is easy to see how later people might look at this and speak of the sons of Osiris, but we need to be careful with that phrase. In a mythological sense, yes, Egyptian kingship was built around sacred sonship. The king could be understood through divine relationships, divine roles, and divine patterns. He was not just a private person who happened to hold office. He was woven into a story about cosmic legitimacy. But that is not the same thing as saying there was a single biological Osirian bloodline waiting to be preserved, smuggled, or rediscovered by medieval knights. The difference may sound small, but it changes the entire investigation. A symbolic lineage passes through ritual, office, belief, and cultural memory. A biological lineage passes through bodies, births, marriages, and generations that can, at least in principle, be traced. Ancient Egyptian kingship certainly cared about descent, inheritance, and royal legitimacy. Dynasties mattered. Families mattered. Succession mattered intensely. But the divine pattern surrounding kingship was larger than family record-keeping. A new ruler could step into the role of Horus not because someone had secretly tested his blood for divinity, but because kingship itself was imagined as participation in a sacred drama. This is one of the places where modern bloodline theories often make their first quiet mistake. They take a religious metaphor and treat it like a hidden family tree. They see divine sonship and translate it into genetics. They see sacred kingship and imagine a private hereditary secret. They see ritual continuity and assume biological continuity must be underneath it. But ancient religion was often more subtle than that. A ritual role could be real without being literal in the modern sense. A king could be son of a god as a statement of sacred identity, not as a claim that a divine being appeared in the family records between two royal uncles and a politically useful marriage alliance. There is a dry little comedy in how modern speculation sometimes tries to make myth more material than the ancients needed it to be. As if a god's power only becomes convincing once it behaves like a legal inheritance dispute. For the Egyptians, the power of Osiris did not depend on being reduced to a secret bloodstream. His presence was sustained through temple worship, funerary texts, festival performance, royal ideology, and the repeating imagination of death and renewal. He was a god whose story gave shape to the passage from life to afterlife, from ruler to successor, from disruption to order. The sons of Osiris, then, are best understood as symbolic heirs within a sacred pattern. They are the kings who stand in the place of Horus. They are the dead who hope to be renewed through Osirian promise. They are, in a broader sense, all those who enter the mythic grammar of death and return. That broader sense is precisely what made Osiris so portable in later imagination. Once his story is treated as a language of hidden continuity, almost anyone can be made to speak it. A priesthood can be called Osirian. A royal house can be called Osirian. A secret order can be called Osirian. The word begins to float away from Egypt and attach itself to whatever later age is searching for sacred depth. This does not mean the symbol is meaningless. Quite the opposite. Symbols survive because they are adaptable. They can cross borders that documents cannot. They can outlive the institutions that first carried them. They can be misunderstood, reinterpreted, romanticized, or deliberately reshaped. By the time European occult writers began to look back toward Egypt as a cradle of hidden wisdom, Osiris had become more than an ancient god. He had become a sign of lost initiation, buried truth, resurrection, and royal secrecy. But that later use should not be confused with ancient evidence. When the Templars eventually enter the story, they do not enter a world where Osiris is waiting for them with a neatly preserved bloodline. They enter a world already thick with sacred geography, contested memory, and older civilizations whose ruins could be read in many ways. Later generations would look backward and connect those layers, sometimes imaginatively, sometimes carelessly. The phrase, "Sons of Osiris," gives the legend its emotional force because it sounds like a lineage. It sounds like fathers and heirs. It sounds like something guarded. It sounds like a secret that could move from temple to fortress, from priest to knight, from the Nile to Jerusalem, and then into the hidden corners of Europe. But when we strip away the later romance, what remains is not a proven chain of blood. It is a chain of meanings. Osiris represents the sacred king who is lost and yet remains powerful. Horus represents the living heir who restores order. The pharaoh stands inside that divine relationship as the earthly image of legitimacy, and later mythmakers, seeing the pattern, imagined that such legitimacy might have survived not only as a religious idea, but as a hidden inheritance. That is the leap. It is the leap from myth to genealogy, from symbol to secret, from sacred kingship to secret blood. And most of the legend depends on making that leap feel natural enough that no one notices the gap beneath it. Chapter 5. The Templars enter the world of ancient gods. When the Templars entered the East, they did not enter an empty stage. They entered a world already crowded with memory. The roads to Jerusalem carried pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, monks, translators, envoys, spies, and men who were probably all of those things depending on the day. A knight could ride past a Christian shrine, an Islamic fortress, a marketplace filled with several languages, and ruins whose builders belonged to a world no living person fully understood. The geography itself seemed to argue with every attempt to simplify it. This is one of the reasons later legends found the crusading world so useful. It was layered, and layered places invite layered explanations. The Knights Templar began as a Christian military order in the aftermath of the First Crusade, tied to the protection of pilgrims and the defense of Latin Christian power in the Holy Land. Their identity, at least in official terms, was not Egyptian, pagan, or occult. It was monastic and military. They prayed, obeyed a rule, held property, fought when commanded, and answered to a religious vision shaped by medieval Christianity. But their surroundings were not limited to the world that created them. To live in the Eastern Mediterranean was to encounter older civilizations not as museum exhibits, but as part of the landscape. Ancient stones were reused, sacred places were reinterpreted, stories moved through trade routes and scholarly traditions. Egypt was not some distant abstraction. It was a powerful Islamic territory, a strategic prize, a land of ancient monuments, and in the European imagination, a place associated with both biblical memory and deep antiquity. The Templars themselves did not need to be secret followers of Osiris for Egypt to haunt the edges of their story. It was already there. Egypt appeared in Christian scripture as the land of bondage and refuge, of Joseph and Moses, of the Holy Family fleeing danger. It appeared in classical memory as a place of strange wisdom and ancient priesthoods. It appeared in Crusader strategy as a military target, because control of Egypt meant control of wealth, grain, routes, and political advantage. And it appeared in later imagination as something even more seductive, the supposed source of hidden knowledge older than Greece, Rome, or the Church. That last Egypt, the Egypt of secret wisdom, would become especially important centuries after the Templars were gone. But in the medieval world, fascination did not automatically equal initiation. Contact did not mean conversion. Proximity did not mean inheritance. A Templar stationed in the East might hear stories, see unfamiliar architecture, negotiate with local powers, pass near sites with long histories, or move through a culture far more complex than the Crusader Chronicles often admitted. None of that proves he discovered an Osirian bloodline. It proves something more ordinary and perhaps more interesting. The Templars lived in a zone of contact where cultures could not avoid touching, even when they were at war. And contact zones are dangerous to clean narratives. They blur things. The Crusaders came with hard religious categories, but daily life in the East forced practical entanglements. Enemies could become negotiators. Local knowledge could become necessary. Architecture, medicine, mathematics, trade, and diplomacy did not stay neatly inside the borders of faith. Even hostility required understanding. You cannot hold castles, move money, ransom captives, or navigate alliances without learning something about the world around you. This is where a small but important correction enters the story. The Templars were secretive in the way institutions are often secretive. They had internal rules, ceremonies, finances, chains of command, and military responsibilities. But later myth would stretch that secrecy into something far larger, as though every closed door must have hidden an ancient god. Every treasury must have contained a forbidden scroll. Every whispered instruction must have been an initiation into mysteries older than Christianity. That is not how evidence works. Still, one can understand how the suspicion grew. The Templars were unusual. A monk was not supposed to be a knight, and a knight was not supposed to be a monk. Yet the Templars were both. They lived under vows, but they also became bankers, fortress holders, landowners, and military professionals. Their power crossed borders, their privileges angered rivals, their discipline made them look separate from ordinary society. To supporters, this made them holy defenders. To enemies, it made them arrogant and dangerously independent. To later storytellers, it made them perfect containers for secrets. Place such an order in a region where ancient Egypt, biblical history, Islamic scholarship, and Christian apocalyptic hope all pressed against one another, and the imagination has more than enough material to begin weaving. The myth of the Osirian bloodline depends heavily on this atmosphere, not on a document, not on a named witness, not on a discovered genealogy. Atmosphere. The East becomes a theater of possible revelation. Egypt becomes the ancient source. Jerusalem becomes the sacred center. The Templars become the guardians who might have found something. And once that arrangement is in place, the absence of proof almost becomes part of the attraction. A visible secret would be too easy. A missing secret can be endlessly redesigned. But if we look more carefully, the real historical picture is more grounded. The Templars entered a world of ancient gods, but not as students of those gods. They entered as crusading Christians, shaped by the ambitions and anxieties of Latin Christendom. Their world included Egypt, but their documented interest in Egypt was political and military, not genealogical. They moved through landscapes full of older meaning, but we should not mistake the presence of old symbols for the possession of old blood. And yet, the legend's instinct is not entirely foolish. It senses that places change people. It senses that the Holy Land was not a sealed Christian dream, but a dense historical crossroads. It senses that medieval men who thought they were entering sacred history were also walking across the remains of histories much older than their own. That does not make them heirs of Osiris, but it does explain why, centuries later, someone could imagine them that way. The Templars did not need to discover Egypt's divine past in a hidden chamber beneath a fortress. They only needed to stand close enough to the old world for later imagination to claim that the old world had recognized them. And from that claim, a much larger myth could begin to breathe. Chapter 6. Egypt as target. Egypt as symbol. Egypt entered Crusader thinking first not as an occult homeland, but as a prize. That is less romantic than the legend, but it is closer to the ground. For Latin Christian powers in the Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt mattered because it was strong, wealthy, and strategically placed. It had cities, ports, agricultural abundance, and access to routes that shaped the balance of power across the region. Anyone who dreamed of securing the Crusader states had to think about Egypt sooner or later, not because pyramids whispered secrets to passing knights, but because armies need food, money, territory, and leverage. This is the difference between symbolic Egypt and strategic Egypt. Symbolic Egypt is the Egypt of later imagination. Temples aligned with stars, priesthoods guarding primordial wisdom, gods whose myths seem to speak in codes. Strategic Egypt is the Egypt of rulers, fortresses, campaigns, taxation, fleets, grain, and political calculation. The Templars belonged much more clearly to the Second World. They were not wandering mystics looking for the lost descendants of Osiris. They were part of a crusading system that understood Egypt as a military and political center. In that world, Egypt was dangerous because it could threaten the Latin East. It was desirable because controlling it could shift the entire regional balance. It was discussed, approached, and attacked as a place of power in the most practical sense. And yet, the practical world is often where myth later attaches itself. A failed campaign becomes a rumor. A strategic interest becomes a secret mission. A fortress becomes a hidden archive. A journey toward Egypt becomes, in later retelling, a journey toward ancient knowledge. This is one of the quiet tricks by which legends grow. They do not always invent from nothing. They begin with something real, then change its meaning. The Crusaders really did care about Egypt. That much is not fantasy. But the reason they cared was not the same reason later occult storytellers wanted them to care. Medieval military planners saw Egypt as a key to survival and expansion. Later mythmakers saw Egypt as the source of hidden wisdom. The same geography remained in place, but the motive was rewritten. That rewriting matters because motive is the soul of a historical claim. If the Templars went near Egypt because it was politically essential, that tells one story. If they went because they had uncovered traces of a divine bloodline descending from Osiris, that tells another. The first belongs to documented Crusader strategy. The second belongs to speculation unless evidence appears to support it. And evidence is exactly where the bloodline claim begins to strain. There are no reliable medieval records showing the Templars identified Egypt as their spiritual origin. No solid source says they treated Osiris as an ancestral figure. No dependable document shows them seeking descendants of ancient pharaohs under the cover of crusade. The more dramatic version requires us to believe that the public military logic was only a mask for a private sacred mission. But a claim like that needs more than atmosphere. It needs proof. Without proof, the story becomes an interpretive costume placed over real events. Still, the costume is revealing. Why Egypt? Why not simply say the Templars guarded a Christian relic, a royal secret, or a lost apostolic teaching? Why pull Osiris into the picture? Because Egypt carries a particular symbolic weight in Western imagination. It is ancient enough to feel like a beginning. monumental enough to seem inhumanly durable, religious enough to suggest mysteries behind mysteries. Even when misunderstood, Egypt offers storytellers a language of depth. To say a secret comes from Egypt is to suggest that it predates ordinary history. It gives the legend an older foundation than medieval Europe could provide on its own. The pyramids and temples become evidence in the emotional sense, even when they are not evidence in the historical sense. They make the story feel ancient. They make the secret feel heavier. They make the Templars seem less like an order founded in the pressures of crusading society, and more like the visible tip of something buried beneath civilization itself. This is why Egypt functions so well as both target and symbol. As a target, it explains real crusader attention. As a symbol, it allows later writers to deepen that attention into mystery. The documented military interest becomes the doorway through which unsupported claims can enter. A careful investigation must keep that doorway visible. It must say, yes, the crusading world had reasons to focus on Egypt. It must also say, no, those reasons do not automatically point to Osiris, divine descent, or a preserved sacred bloodline. One of the most common errors in alternative history is the confusion of contact with transmission. If two worlds touch, the theory assumes that the deepest secrets of one must have passed into the other. But contact can be shallow, hostile, practical, partial, misunderstood, or completely ordinary. A crusader army approaching Egypt did not become Egyptian in its religious imagination. A military order operating near older civilizations did not necessarily inherit those civilizations' gods. Yet legends prefer continuity to interruption. They dislike the idea that ancient traditions might simply fade, break, transform, or survive only in fragments. A bloodline solves the discomfort. It says the past did not vanish. It was carried. It had guardians. It moved through danger intact. In that sense, the Osirian Templar myth is less about Egypt as it was, and more about Egypt as later minds needed it to be. A reservoir, a hidden root, a sacred storehouse from which medieval Europe could secretly draw its power. This tells us something about the Templars, too. Their destruction left behind a strange imaginative vacancy. Once the order was gone, people could project almost anything into the empty space. Heresy, treasure, lost rites, hidden masters, forbidden knowledge, secret descendants. Egypt was one of the grandest projections available. It gave the fallen order an ancestry older than the Church that condemned it, and more mysterious than the politics that destroyed it. But the ground beneath the legend remains stubborn. Egypt was a strategic prize. Egypt became a symbol. The first statement belongs to history. The second belongs to imagination. The bloodline theory depends on sliding quietly from one to the other, hoping we will not notice the moment when military geography turns into sacred genealogy. And once we do notice, the mystery changes. It does not disappear. It becomes more honest. The question is no longer whether crusader interest in Egypt proves an Osirian secret. It does not. The question is why a real campaign landscape could later be transformed into a map of hidden inheritance. That transformation is where the legend lives, not in the camps of crusader armies, not in the records of Templar administration, but in the long afterlife of Egypt as an idea, ancient, powerful, misunderstood, and endlessly available to those who believe the deepest truths must have been buried where history first learned to build in stone. Chapter 7. The Missing Link. Every powerful legend has a point where the road breaks. For the Osirian bloodline theory, this is that point. We can follow the story through symbols. We can follow it through geography. We can see why Egypt mattered to Crusader strategy, why Osiris mattered to ancient religion, and why the Templars became such tempting figures for later mythmakers. The atmosphere is rich. The pieces seem to arrange themselves almost too neatly, but then the historian reaches for the bridge between them, and the bridge is not there. No reliable medieval source shows the Templars discovering a surviving lineage of Osiris. No Templar rule, letter, inventory, trial record, or chronicle securely places such a secret at the heart of the order. No Egyptian evidence identifies a hidden royal divine family later transferred into Templar protection. No credible genealogy carries the line from ancient sacred kingship into the commanderies of medieval Europe. This is not a small gap. It is the central gap. And yet, oddly, the absence often makes the legend more seductive rather than less. The missing link becomes part of the drama. People begin to say the evidence vanished because it was dangerous. It was hidden because it mattered. It was destroyed because powerful institutions feared it. This is how an empty space becomes a stage. But absence is not automatically suppression. Sometimes it is simply absence. That may sound severe, but it is also liberating. It allows us to look at the myth without pretending it is a solved case. We can stop forcing the evidence to confess something it does not say. We can ask a more interesting question. What kind of story grows around a missing link? And why does that story feel so satisfying? The answer begins with the Templars' own destruction. When an institution ends violently, it rarely leaves behind a tidy memory. The Knights Templar were arrested, accused, interrogated, and dissolved. Their fall created confusion, fear, resentment, and speculation. Some of the accusations made against them were shaped by politics and pressure. Some confessions were extracted under conditions that make them deeply troubling as evidence. The Order's enemies had reasons to exaggerate. Its defenders had reasons to sanitize. Later admirers had reasons to romanticize. Out of that uncertainty came a long afterlife. The Templars became useful because they were unfinished. A dissolved order cannot correct the record. It cannot issue a calm public statement explaining that no, actually, it was not preserving the divine inheritance of Osiris. And would everyone please return to more sensible topics like property disputes and Crusader logistics? The dead are often made to carry the meanings of the living. In this case, the missing link allows the Templars to become whatever later imagination requires. Guardians of relics, keepers of forbidden rites, heirs of ancient priesthoods, victims of a conspiracy, masters of a secret too large for the official record. The Osirian bloodline is one of the more elaborate versions of that transformation. It borrows the dignity of antiquity from Egypt. It borrows the drama of sacred death from Osiris. It borrows secrecy from the Templars. Then it places all three inside a single hidden chain. The problem is that the chain is mostly made of suggestion, a symbol here, a coincidence there, a later interpretation, a resemblance between myths, a shared fascination with kingship, death, and restoration. These things can make a story feel resonant. They cannot, by themselves, make it historically true. This is where careful storytelling has to resist the easiest temptation. It would be more entertaining to claim that a lost manuscript once existed, that a secret chamber was found, that a final Grand Master whispered the name of Osiris before the flames. But inventing evidence would make the mystery smaller, not larger. It would turn a revealing legend into a cheap puzzle box. The real silence is more interesting, because silence has texture. There is the silence of records that never existed, the silence of archives destroyed for ordinary reasons, the silence of people who did not think to write down what later ages desperately want to know, the silence created when modern expectations are placed on medieval institutions that operated by different assumptions. And there is the silence that comes from asking the wrong kind of question. Perhaps the bloodline theory fails not only because proof is missing, but because it mistakes the nature of inheritance. Ancient Egyptian sacred kingship was not preserved by a European military order. Osiris did not need a hidden medieval bloodline in order to survive. He survived through myth, ritual, texts, images, reinterpretation, and the long memory of cultures that kept returning to Egypt as a source of meaning. The Templars, too, survived less through biology than through imagination. Their institutional life ended. Their symbolic life expanded. So the missing link may tell us something the legend itself does not intend. It tells us that people often search for blood when what actually survived was story. They look for a family line because a family line feels firm. It can be mapped, inherited, defended. It gives the past a body, but symbols travel more freely than blood ever could. They pass through books, rituals, architecture, rumor, art, fear, longing, and misinterpretation. They do not require a perfect chain. They survive by being remade. The Osirian Templar legend, then, does not collapse simply because the missing link is missing. It changes category. It becomes not a hidden fact waiting to be uncovered, but a modern myth built from real historical fragments and symbolic desire. Its emptiness is not useless. It shows us where imagination stepped in to repair a break that history would not close. And that is why the investigation cannot simply rush past this absence. The missing link is the heart of the matter. It is the place where evidence ends and longing begins. And almost every secret history, if followed long enough, eventually arrives at a place like this, a threshold where the documents stop speaking and the human need for continuity begins speaking in their place. Chapter 8. From Relics to Bloodlines. Medieval Christianity lived close to objects. Not ordinary objects exactly, though many of them looked ordinary enough from a distance. A fragment of bone, a strip of cloth, a splinter of wood, a vessel, a stone, a garment. A body part sealed in metal and carried through a city on feast days. To modern eyes, this can seem strange, even uncomfortable. But to the medieval religious imagination, matter was not spiritually neutral. The holy could touch the physical world, and once it did, the physical world could remember. Relics mattered because they made sacred history local. A saint might have died centuries earlier and far away, but a relic brought that saint into the present tense. It gave a monastery prestige, a town identity, a church authority, a pilgrim a destination. It made holiness visible, portable, and, in some cases, politically valuable. A community with a powerful relic did not merely own an object. It possessed a point of contact with the divine. This matters for the Templar legend, because medieval people did not need a modern conspiracy theory to care deeply about hidden sacred things. They already did. The crusading world, was filled with the search for holy places, holy remains, and holy proofs. The landscape of the East was read through scripture and tradition. A road was not just a road if it could be connected to a biblical journey. A hill was not only a hill if it could be linked to prophecy, sacrifice, or resurrection. Jerusalem itself was a city where geography and theology pressed so tightly together that stones seemed to carry memory. The Templars belonged to that world. As guardians of pilgrims and participants in Crusader society, they stood near the center of medieval Christianity's hunger for sacred contact. Their name itself came from proximity to the temple area in Jerusalem. Their image became bound to holy warfare, pilgrimage, and sacred geography. It is not difficult to understand why later writers imagined them searching for something hidden beneath or behind the visible religion of their age. But here, again, the meaning shifts. A medieval search for relics is not the same thing as a modern search for bloodlines. A relic is a physical trace of holiness. A bloodline is biological continuity turned into destiny. Both promise contact with the past, but they do so in very different ways. The relic says, "Something sacred touched the world, and this fragment remains." The bloodline says, "Something sacred entered human descent, and its living carriers remain." That second idea has a special power because it makes the past breathe. A relic can be locked in a shrine. A bloodline can walk through a marketplace without being recognized. It can marry, disappear, change its name, cross borders, survive a massacre, and reappear centuries later in a theory that insists the visible world has always been incomplete. For storytellers, bloodline myths are irresistible because they turn history into inheritance. They suggest that the sacred is not merely remembered, but embodied. This is one reason later imagination could transform Templar relic hunting into something far stranger. If the Templars were believed to have searched under sacred ground, guarded mysterious treasures, or encountered forbidden knowledge, then it was only a small step, at least for speculative writers, to ask whether the treasure had been misunderstood. Perhaps it was not gold. Perhaps it was not a cup, a scroll, or a fragment of the true cross. Perhaps the treasure was a lineage. Notice the movement. The object becomes a person. The shrine becomes a family. The reliquary becomes the body. This is not medieval evidence. It is later reinterpretation, but it tells us something important about the changing shape of mystery. In the medieval world, holiness often gathered around visible matter. In the modern world, secrecy often gathers around hidden identity. We are fascinated by documents that reveal someone's true ancestry, by names concealed in archives, by descendants living unaware of what they carry. A relic asks us to kneel before a trace. A bloodline asks us to suspect the person standing next to us. That shift helps explain why the Templars were eventually pulled into genealogical fantasies. Their real history involved vows, property, warfare, religious discipline, and institutional secrecy. Later legends converted those features into signs of a hidden mission. The Order's treasuries became imagined vaults of forbidden truth. Its ceremonies became supposed initiations. Its connection to sacred places became evidence of discovery, and its destruction became the perfect explanation for why the proof was lost. A legend needs pressure to become convincing. The Templars' fall provided that pressure. If an order was destroyed, then anything it guarded could have been scattered. If its leaders were executed or imprisoned, then its knowledge could have been driven underground. If its archives were fragmented, then missing evidence could be treated not as weakness, but as confirmation. The bloodline theory feeds on exactly this logic. Yet there is a discipline in refusing that easy conclusion. What we can say with more confidence is that medieval religious culture gave later mythmakers a rich vocabulary of sacred preservation, relics, holy ancestry, royal legitimacy, pilgrimage, sacred geography. All of these were real forces in the medieval imagination. They made the past feel alive and morally charged. They taught people to believe that holiness could be carried, guarded, stolen, authenticated, and fought over. What we cannot say is that this vocabulary proves a preserved Osirian descent. The legend borrows the emotional structure of relic culture, but changes its contents. Instead of a saint's bone, it offers divine blood. Instead of a chapel treasury, it imagines a secret family line. Instead of public veneration, it imagines concealment. And this is where the story becomes especially revealing. The supposed bloodline beneath the Templar cross is not only a claim about the Middle Ages, it is a mirror of modern desire. We want sacred history to be more than symbolic. We want it to have a hidden mechanism. We want a secret that can survive institutions, doctrines, and the collapse of empires. Blood offers that mechanism because blood feels older than writing and harder to erase than memory. But the older religious world did not always need that mechanism. For medieval believers, a relic could already collapse time. A piece of the holy past could sit in the present, surrounded by incense, song, skepticism, devotion, and occasionally very practical concerns about donation revenue. Human beings have rarely separated the sacred from the administrative as cleanly as they pretend. The modern bloodline legend takes that same longing for contact and makes it hereditary. It says the sacred fragment was never in a box. It was in the body. And once that idea appears, the Templars become more than guardians of pilgrims. They become imagined custodians of living relics, not saints' remains, but sacred descendants. There is no reliable proof that they were. But the transformation from relic to bloodline explains how the myth learned to feel plausible. It did not need to invent the medieval hunger for sacred traces. That hunger was real. It only had to redirect it, away from bones and wood and cloth, toward the more intimate mystery of ancestry. And in that redirection, the legend found one of its strongest disguises. It began to sound less like fantasy and more like a secret form of devotion. Chapter 9. The Temple Mount and the Egyptian Echo. The Templar's story is almost impossible to separate from one place, Jerusalem. More specifically, from the sacred plateau known to Jews as the Temple Mount, to Muslims as the Haram al-Sharif, and to medieval Christians as one of the most charged landscapes on earth. It was not just a location, it was a compression of memory, conquest, scripture, longing, and competing claims of holiness. For the early Templars, the association was built into their identity. Their headquarters stood near the area linked in Christian imagination to the Temple of Solomon. From that association came their name, the Poor Knights of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. That name would become one of the most powerful engines of later speculation. Because once a military order is called the Temple, people begin to imagine what a temple might conceal. It is important to separate the medieval reality from the later dream. The Templars did not become famous because they published architectural theories about Solomon, Egypt, and sacred geometry. They became famous because they were a military religious order at the center of Crusader power. Their connection to the Temple Mount was institutional, symbolic, and practical before it was mysterious. But symbols do not remain obedient. The Temple Mount had already gathered centuries of meaning before the Templars arrived. It was associated with biblical kingship, divine presence, sacrifice, destruction, prophecy, and sacred memory. To stand near it was to stand inside a religious argument that had been unfolding long before any crusader took a vow. Later writers looked at this and asked a tempting question. What if the Templars found something there? Not simply treasure, not simply relics. Knowledge, a hidden tradition, a buried architecture of the sacred. From there, the Egyptian echo enters the story. Solomon's temple, in later esoteric imagination, was often treated as more than a biblical building. It became a model of cosmic order, divine proportion, and hidden wisdom expressed through measurement. Egypt, meanwhile, was imagined as the ancient source of priestly science, sacred geometry, initiation, and monumental architecture. Place these two symbolic worlds near the Templars, and the speculative chain begins to form. The Temple Mount becomes the meeting point. Solomon becomes the biblical architect of wisdom. Egypt becomes the older reservoir of sacred design. The Templars become the guardians who might have learned what those stones were really saying. It is a beautiful construction, but beauty is not evidence. There is no reliable medieval proof that the Templars uncovered an Egyptian architectural code beneath Jerusalem. No trustworthy source shows them decoding Solomon's temple as a disguised Osirian inheritance. No archaeological discovery connects their headquarters to a preserved bloodline of Egyptian divine kings. The symbolic associations are real as later interpretations. They are not proof of the central claim. Still, we should not dismiss the symbolism too quickly, because it helps explain why the legend feels so durable. Architecture has a special power in secret histories. A text can be lost. A witness can lie. A bloodline can be disputed. But a building seems to sit there with mute authority, as if stone itself must know something we have forgotten. Measurements become clues. Alignments become intentions. Similar shapes become signs of a shared tradition. Sometimes this kind of study can be serious and careful. Ancient builders did use proportion, orientation, religious symbolism, and cosmological ideas. Sacred architecture often expresses a worldview. Temples are rarely just shelters with better decoration. They tell the worshipper where heaven, earth, ruler, God, and community are supposed to meet. The problem begins when interpretation outruns evidence. A column does not prove a conspiracy. A geometric pattern does not prove transmission. A resemblance between buildings does not prove a secret order carried Egyptian wisdom into medieval Europe. Human beings often solve similar symbolic problems in similar ways. Sacred centers rise. Axes are marked. Thresholds are emphasized. Light is controlled. Heights and depths are given meaning. The architecture of awe has recurring habits. But recurring habits are not the same as a hidden bloodline. This is where the Temple Mount became so useful to the Osirian Templar myth. It offered a setting where almost any hidden discovery seemed imaginable. The Templars were physically associated with a place already believed to rest over layers of sacred history. They had enough privacy to invite suspicion. They had enough power to make secrecy plausible. And they had a name that sounded as if it belonged not merely to war, but to initiation. Later, esoteric traditions would take full advantage of that. They transformed the Templars from defenders of pilgrims into custodians of architectural and spiritual mysteries. The temple became less a headquarters and more a cipher. The stones of Jerusalem were made to speak in the language of Egypt. Solomon and Osiris were placed into the same symbolic conversation, not because medieval evidence demands it, but because later imagination wanted a single hidden tradition beneath many religions. That desire is worth noticing. Many secret history theories are driven by the hope that different sacred traditions are fragments of one lost original truth. Egypt, Israel, Christianity, medieval chivalry, and modern occultism are arranged like scattered pieces of a broken vessel. The storyteller then claims to reassemble them, much as Isis reassembled Osiris. The method mirrors the myth, and perhaps that is why the theory feels emotionally satisfying, even when historically fragile. It promises that religious difference is only surface. It promises that beneath the wars, doctrines, and ruins, there is one continuous design. It promises that the Templars stood at the place where the design could be recovered. The Temple Mount, in this reading, becomes not merely a contested holy site, but a hinge between worlds, biblical and Egyptian, Christian and ancient, visible and hidden. Yet the evidence will not let us cross that hinge as fact. We can only describe it as a later symbolic construction. What can be said more carefully is this. The Templars' association with the Temple Mount gave later generations an extraordinary canvas. Onto that canvas they painted hidden chambers, lost measurements, buried relics, secret wisdom, and eventually bloodlines. Some of those ideas drew on real features of medieval sacred geography. Others belonged almost entirely to later occult romance. The Egyptian echo, then, is not the sound of proof coming up from beneath the stones. It is the sound of interpretation traveling backward. Later centuries looked at Jerusalem through Egypt-colored glass. They saw Solomon's temple not only as biblical, but as architectural mystery. They saw the Templars not only as crusaders, but as initiates. They saw sacred geometry not only as design, but as coded inheritance. And in that backward gaze, the myth found one of its most persuasive settings, a place where stone seemed older than speech, a name that invited secrets, a military order whose silence could be made to mean anything. But the careful listener should keep one distinction close. The Temple Mount explains why people imagined the Templars discovering hidden wisdom. It does not prove that they did. And it certainly does not prove that what they discovered was the living blood of Osiris. Chapter 10. The Occult Rebirth of the Templars. The Templars did not become legendary at the height of their power. Not fully. They became legendary after they were gone. That is often how these things work. An institution in motion is too busy being practical, flawed, political, expensive, and human. It owns land. It argues over privileges. It manages men, horses, accounts, fortresses, ships, debts, failures, and reputations. But once it is destroyed, the rough edges begin to soften. The paperwork fades from memory. The accusations remain dramatic. The silence becomes suggestive. The ruins become available. After the order's suppression, the Templars entered a second life, not as an official military brotherhood, but as an idea. And this second life proved far more flexible than the first. In later centuries, especially within esoteric and occult traditions, the Templars were reimagined as guardians of hidden knowledge. They were no longer only crusader monks. They became initiates, secret masters, victims of persecution because they knew too much, carriers of a tradition older than the church that condemned them. This transformation did not happen because medieval evidence suddenly revealed an Egyptian bloodline. It happened because the Templars were perfectly shaped for reinvention. They had a dramatic fall. They had a sacred name. They had secrecy, wealth, and association with Jerusalem. They had been accused of strange rites, though the reliability of those accusations remains deeply problematic. They left behind enough historical uncertainty for later writers to enter the room and rearrange the furniture. And Egypt was waiting. By the time European esoteric movements began building elaborate systems of initiation, symbolism, and hidden ancestry, Egypt had become a kind of imagined origin point. Not always the real Egypt of language, temple administration, local cults, dynastic politics, and changing religious practice. More often, it was Egypt as a grand symbol, the land of mysteries, priestly wisdom, death and rebirth, sacred measurement, veiled gods, and knowledge preserved from the dawn of civilization. This imagined Egypt was extremely useful. It could lend age to new movements. It could give ritual a deeper costume. It could make a modern ceremony feel like a recovered fragment of antiquity. It could make an invented lineage feel venerable. Here the Templars and Egypt met again, not in the archives of the 12th century, but in the workshops of later imagination. A ritual room could borrow Egyptian imagery. A secret society could claim continuity with ancient mystery schools. A writer could suggest that the Templars had learned from Eastern sages, Egyptian priests, or keepers of primordial doctrine. A symbolic death and rebirth initiation could be placed beside the myth of Osiris, and the resemblance would seem too meaningful to ignore. But resemblance is doing almost all the work. The occult rebirth of the Templars depends on a shift from historical order to symbolic vessel. Once the Templars become a vessel, they can carry almost anything. Christian relics, Gnostic wisdom, Hermetic philosophy, royal secrets, alchemical teachings, Egyptian mysteries, or bloodlines whose evidence is always just beyond reach. The Order's destruction made this easier. A surviving organization has limits. It has records, members, disputes, rules, and living authorities who can contradict romantic nonsense. A destroyed organization has mystique. It cannot defend itself very well, and it cannot complain when later centuries dress it in robes it never wore. This is not to say that all later esoteric interest in the Templars was foolish or meaningless. Myths can be intellectually serious even when they are not historically literal. Occult traditions often used historical figures as symbolic ancestors, not because the documents proved direct descent, but because the figures represented qualities the movement wanted to inherit: courage, secrecy, sacrifice, hidden wisdom, persecution by corrupt power. In that sense, the Templars were irresistible. They appeared as holy warriors betrayed by worldly authority. They seemed disciplined, dangerous, and spiritually charged. They were close enough to the sacred geography of the East to suggest contact with older wisdom. And their end was tragic enough to make them look like martyrs to a truth no one could safely name. Egyptian motifs deepened that drama. Osiris, after all, was the murdered king whose body was broken and whose power survived in another form. The Templars were a broken order whose memory survived through rumor. Later writers could place the two stories side by side and feel a pattern: a fallen sacred power, a violent interruption, a hidden continuation, a promise that death was not final, The pattern is elegant. It is also, historically speaking, a pattern made after the fact. There is no need to accuse every later interpreter of fraud. Many were working within symbolic systems where myth, ritual, and history were deliberately blended. The problem begins when symbolic lineage is presented as documentary fact. A society may claim the spirit of Egypt. It may build rituals around Osirian themes. It may treat the Templars as imagined ancestors in a chain of initiation, but that does not prove a medieval biological line from Osiris, nor a secret Templar mission to preserve one. This distinction is not a technicality. It is the difference between understanding a tradition and being captured by it. If someone says, "The Templars became a symbol through which later occultists imagined ancient wisdom," that is a historically cautious statement. If someone says, "The Templars truly guarded the blood of Osiris," that requires evidence of an entirely different kind, and the evidence is not there. What is there is a fascinating afterlife. A medieval order dissolved under accusation becomes, centuries later, a mirror for societies that wanted depth, secrecy, and ancient legitimacy. Egypt supplies the atmosphere of primordial wisdom. Osiris supplies the drama of death and rebirth. The Templars supply the secrecy, the persecution, and the martial romance. Together, they form a mythic machine so efficient that it can keep producing theories long after the historical fuel has run out. That may sound dismissive, but it should not be. The occult rebirth of the Templars tells us something profound about modernity. As traditional religious authority weakened for many people, the hunger for sacred continuity did not vanish. It changed form. People still wanted initiation. They still wanted hidden origins. They still wanted to believe that beneath official history there was a deeper current, guarded by those with eyes to see. The Templars became one of the favorite names for that current. Egypt became one of its favorite sources, and Osiris became one of its favorite masks. So when we hear claims that a bloodline from ancient Egypt passed through the temple, we are often hearing not a medieval memory, but an occult-era dream projected backward. A dream in which the broken order is restored, the murdered god is remembered, and history itself becomes an initiation chamber. The question is not whether that dream has power. It clearly does. The question is whether power should be mistaken for proof. And here, the answer must remain careful. The Templars were reborn in occult imagination, but imagination, even when beautifully arranged, cannot resurrect a bloodline from evidence that was never there. Chapter 11. Bloodline myths and the hunger for continuity. There is a reason bloodline stories keep returning. They are not just about ancestry. They are about refusal. A refusal to accept that the past can be broken. A refusal to believe that sacred authority can vanish when temples close, orders fall, libraries burn, or kings die without heirs strong enough to hold the throne. Bloodline myths insist that somewhere beneath the visible wreckage, continuity survived. That is their deepest promise. Not accuracy, continuity. The Osirian Templar legend belongs to this larger family of stories. It imagines history as a chain hidden under catastrophe, ancient gods, divine kings, priesthoods, secret guardians, medieval orders, modern descendants. Each age appears to lose the treasure, and each age secretly passes it on. The result is a world where nothing truly ends. It only goes underground. This idea is emotionally powerful because real history is much less comforting. Real history breaks things. Languages disappear. Rituals become unreadable. Royal lines fail. Sacred buildings are abandoned, reused, demolished, or absorbed into new traditions. Archives are damaged by war, weather, neglect, insects, politics, and the ordinary impatience of people who need storage space more than they need future historians to be happy. A bloodline myth answers that messiness with elegance. It says, "The chain was never broken. You simply did not know where to look." This is why hidden descent can feel more satisfying than ordinary cultural survival. A symbol passed through books and rituals may seem too fragile. A bloodline feels physical. It gives mystery a pulse. It places the secret not in a manuscript that can be burned, but in living bodies that can cross borders, change names, and survive unnoticed. That is also why these stories often gather around figures of sacred kingship. Kingship already carries the language of succession. One ruler falls, another rises. The crown passes. The body politic survives through the body of the heir. In Egyptian religion, this logic was intensified by the relationship between Osiris and Horus. The dead king transformed, the living sun ruling, order restored through sacred inheritance. Later imagination did not need to understand every nuance of Egyptian theology to feel the force of that pattern. A murdered king, a surviving heir, a hidden legitimacy. It is almost a perfect seed for a secret bloodline tale. Add the Templars, and the seed finds soil. The Templars provide secrecy, discipline, violence, sacred geography, and a dramatic ending. They are not ancient enough on their own to reach the beginning of civilization, but they are medieval enough to stand between antiquity and the modern world. They become, in the legend, a bridge, not the origin, not the final heirs. The custodians. This role matters. Secret history myths often depend on custodians. The sacred thing cannot simply survive by accident. Someone must guard it. Someone must understand its value when the rest of the world forgets. Someone must carry the burden through persecution, exile, or institutional collapse. Without custodians, continuity looks random. With them, continuity looks chosen. The Templars were ideal candidates because they already seemed like men under vows. They belonged to a rule. They had internal ceremonies. They moved across borders. They answered to a mission larger than ordinary life. Once later, writers decided that mission might have been hidden. The order could be made to guard almost anything. The emotional logic is easy to follow. If Osiris represents sacred kingship shattered by violence, and the Templars represent sacred brotherhood shattered by political destruction, then linking them creates a double resurrection. The god survives through blood. The order survives through secrecy. The past survives through both. But emotional logic is not historical proof. This is where the hunger for continuity can mislead us. It encourages us to prefer the story that feels whole over the record that remains incomplete. A broken archive becomes intolerable. A symbolic resemblance becomes too tempting. A lack of evidence becomes not a warning, but an invitation. And because bloodline myths are built around concealment, they are unusually resistant to correction. Evidence against them can be dismissed as part of the cover-up. Missing documents can be treated as signs of suppression. Contradictions can be explained as deliberate misdirection. The theory protects itself by making absence useful. That does not make it unique. Many powerful myths work this way, but it does mean we should handle it carefully. A good mystery allows uncertainty. A bad one demands belief. The Osirian Templar bloodline is compelling when treated as a map of longing. It becomes weak when treated as a documented genealogy. The historical materials do not support a literal descent from Egypt's divine past into a medieval Christian military order. What they do show is something subtler. Human beings repeatedly reshape the past into a pattern they can bear, and the pattern they often choose is inheritance. Why? Because inheritance gives time a moral structure. It says the past selected the present. It says we are not merely latecomers walking among ruins, but receivers of a charge. Someone before us guarded something. Someone suffered for it. Someone concealed it so that it might reach us. That belief can be intoxicating. It can also be consoling. Modern people often live with a sense of severance from the ancient world. We see monuments, read translations, visit museums, and feel both closeness and distance. The stones remain, but the voices are altered. We know more than many earlier ages knew in technical terms, yet we often feel less initiated. Knowledge is available, but belonging is not. Bloodline myths solve that problem by turning knowledge into identity. They say you do not merely study the ancient secret. You may descend from it. You may carry it without knowing. That is a far stronger claim than influence, symbolism, or admiration. It transforms curiosity into destiny. It lets the viewer, reader, or believer stand near the center of the story rather than outside it. And perhaps this is the quiet reason such legends survive. They flatter the human wish to matter to history. Not as a footnote, not as a tourist, as an heir. In the end, the hunger for continuity is not foolish. It comes from a real wound. Civilizations do break. Sacred languages are forgotten. Communities lose their stories. People look at the past and feel that something essential has slipped through their hands. But the honest answer to loss is not always a hidden bloodline. Sometimes it is memory. Sometimes it is scholarship. Sometimes it is ritual transformed across time. Sometimes it is the survival of a symbol that changes shape but still carries emotional truth. The Osiris legend endured because it spoke to death and renewal. The Templar legend endured because destruction made the order seem unfinished. Their fusion into a bloodline myth tells us less about a secret family and more about a human need. To believe that the sacred does not merely vanish when history turns violent. That need is understandable. It may even be beautiful. But beauty cannot carry the burden of proof. Chapter 12. The Osiris Code in later imagination. Osiris has always been difficult to leave in one place. In ancient Egypt, he belonged to temples, tombs, kingship, fertility, judgment, and the hidden geography of the afterlife. But once Egypt became, in later centuries, an object of European fascination, Osiris began to travel in a different way. Not through priesthoods or royal cult, but through books, symbols, rituals, theories, and the long appetite for ancient secrets. He became a figure people could use, a sign, a code. Not a code, in the literal sense of a cipher waiting to be cracked by measuring stones or rearranging names, but a symbolic code. A way of speaking about death that is not final, kingship that survives defeat, knowledge that disappears from the surface and returns in disguised form. That made him extremely attractive to occult and alternative history writers. Osiris could stand for resurrection without being fully Christian. He could suggest sacred kingship without belonging to any living monarchy. He could carry the atmosphere of ancient Egypt without requiring the writer to understand ancient Egyptian religion in all its complexity. He was old, solemn, mysterious, and already associated with a body broken and restored. For anyone building a theory of hidden continuity, he was almost too useful. This is where the so-called Osiris Code begins to take shape in later imagination. The pattern is familiar. A powerful ancient truth is shattered. Its fragments survive. A chosen few preserve them. A later order inherits them. The modern investigator begins to notice the signs. It is a deeply satisfying structure because it turns history into a ritual of recovery. The reader is no longer simply learning about the past. They are joining Isis in the search for the scattered body. Every symbol becomes a limb. Every ruin becomes a clue. Every secret society becomes a possible guardian of the missing whole. And once the Templars are placed inside that pattern, their history changes color. Their suppression becomes dismemberment. Their rumored survival becomes resurrection. Their association with sacred sites becomes initiation. Their silence becomes evidence of concealment. Osiris provides the mythic grammar, and the Templars provide the medieval costume. But the costume is not the body. The danger in these interpretations is that they often begin with metaphor and quietly end with assertion. At first, Osiris is a symbol of hidden continuity. Then he becomes a source of hidden doctrine. Then that doctrine becomes a guarded tradition. Then the guarded tradition becomes a bloodline. By the end, what began as interpretive language is presented as if it were recoverable fact. This is not careful history, it is symbolic escalation. That escalation is common in alternative history because symbols are flexible. A symbol does not have to obey the rules of chronology, documentation, or geography. It can leap, it can echo, it can attach itself to a medieval order, a Renaissance text, a modern initiation rite, or a private theory with equal ease. Symbols are generous that way, sometimes too generous. Osiris, especially, lends himself to this because his myth already contains absence. The dead king is not simply present. He is sought. He is reassembled. He is transformed. He rules from a realm that is powerful precisely because it is hidden from ordinary sight. Later writers could look at that structure and see, or imagine they saw, the blueprint for secret transmission. If the god survives by being concealed and restored, then perhaps knowledge also survives that way. Perhaps royal legitimacy survives that way. Perhaps even blood survives that way. But perhaps is not proof. It is the beginning of a story. The more grounded interpretation is that Osiris became a recurring figure because he solved a problem for later imaginations. He allowed people to connect death with continuity without relying only on familiar Christian categories. He offered a sacred drama of loss and return that could be placed beneath many different systems. For occult thinkers, he could be the Lord of initiation. For alternative historians, he could be the sign of a suppressed ancient inheritance. For symbolic writers, he could represent the hidden king within the ruins of history. Each use tells us something about the interpreter, not necessarily about the Templars. This distinction is crucial. When a later author invokes Osiris to explain the Templars, We have to ask, are they preserving medieval memory? Or are they projecting a later symbolic system backward onto the Middle Ages? In the case of the bloodline theory, the evidence points much more strongly toward projection. The Osirian framework appears as a later lens through which the Templars are reread, not as a demonstrable tradition carried by the order itself. Yet the lens is worth studying, because through it, we can see how modern mystery-making works. First, it chooses a figure with deep symbolic charge. Osiris is perfect, ancient, royal, murdered, restored, hidden. Then it chooses an institution with historical secrecy and a dramatic fall. The Templars are perfect, disciplined, powerful, accused, dissolved, unfinished. Then it joins them through a theme that feels universal: death and return, lost kingship, sacred inheritance, the survival of forbidden knowledge. The result feels older than its own construction. That is the trick. A modern synthesis can feel ancient because its ingredients are ancient. But ancient ingredients do not automatically make an ancient recipe. A story can be built from old stones and still be new. This does not mean the story has no value. The symbolic Osiris code reveals something honest about the human imagination. We want broken things to have a hidden order. We want the fragments to belong together. We want scattered traditions to be parts of a larger body waiting to be restored. But history does not always give us a body. Sometimes it gives us fragments that remain fragments. The careful investigator has to accept that. Osiris can illuminate the emotional shape of the Templar myth without proving its literal claims. He can explain why the legend feels coherent. He cannot, by himself, supply the missing documents, genealogies, or archaeological evidence. So when later imagination speaks of Osiris behind the Templars, we should listen in two ways: with curiosity, because the symbol is powerful, and with caution, because power is not the same as origin. The code of Osiris may not be a secret message left by ancient priests for medieval knights. It may be something more human, a recurring pattern by which people make meaning out of rupture. A king is murdered. An order is destroyed. A civilization fades. The mind refuses to accept that the story ends there. It begins searching for the hidden continuation. And in that search, Osiris returns again. Not necessarily in blood, not necessarily in fact, but in the old and stubborn hope that what has been broken may still, somehow, be made whole. Chapter 13. What the myth borrows from history. A weak myth invents everything. A strong myth borrows. That is why the Osirian bloodline theory cannot be dismissed as nonsense made from empty air. It is not supported as a literal genealogy, but it does draw strength from real historical fragments. These fragments do not prove the claim. They explain why the claim feels possible, and that difference matters. The first borrowed fragment is Templar secrecy. The order did have internal rules, initiations, discipline, and closed institutional life. Medieval religious orders were not public clubs with friendly visitor brochures and a helpful question desk at the entrance. They had vows, hierarchies, procedures, and rituals that outsiders did not fully see. For most institutions, that would be ordinary. For the Templars, because their power grew so large and their fall became so violent, ordinary secrecy later looked like evidence of extraordinary secrecy. The second borrowed fragment is Crusader contact with the East. The Templars operated in a world of cultural contact, conflict, negotiation, and exchange. They were not sealed inside a purely European bubble. They lived near Muslim powers, Eastern Christian communities, Jewish sacred geography, Byzantine memory, and the older civilizations that haunted the landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean. Egypt stood close enough to matter politically and symbolically. That contact was real. But contact is not confession. A knight can move through a world of older gods without becoming their disciple. An order can operate near Egypt without preserving Egyptian blood. A battlefield, treaty, or pilgrimage road does not automatically become an initiation path. The third borrowed fragment is sacred kingship. Here the myth finds some of its richest material. Ancient Egypt did link kingship to divine order. Osiris, Horus, and the pharaoh formed a powerful sacred pattern of death, inheritance, legitimacy, and renewal. Medieval Europe, too, cared deeply about holy kingship, dynastic right, and divine sanction. These worlds were not the same, but they shared a concern with authority that seemed to come from more than human agreement. A later storyteller can place those ideas beside each other and feel a current pass between them. The murdered king Osiris, the living heir Horus, the sacred ruler, the hidden legitimacy. Then the Templars enter as guardians, and the whole thing begins to look like a lost royal drama stretched across centuries. It is compelling because it uses real themes, but themes are not proof of transmission. The fourth borrowed fragment is the medieval fascination with relics. The Middle Ages gave enormous importance to sacred matter. Bones, wood, cloth, vessels, tombs, shrines, and places where divine history seemed to touch the world. That fascination helps explain why later generations could imagine the Templars guarding something physical and holy. In ordinary legend, that might be a relic. In a more modern, genealogical version, it becomes blood. The emotional structure remains similar. Something sacred survived in matter. But the content has changed. A relic can be displayed, hidden, stolen, authenticated, doubted, or venerated. A bloodline does something more dramatic. It turns the sacred object into a living person. It gives the past descendants. It makes history breathe. The fifth borrowed fragment is the survival of Egyptian symbolism. Egypt did not vanish from later imagination. Its gods, monuments, myths, and symbolic vocabulary were repeatedly rediscovered, misunderstood, admired, romanticized, and repurposed. Osiris became especially useful because he carried the language of death and return. To later esoteric writers, he could stand for initiation, hidden kingship, resurrection, and the survival of ancient wisdom beneath the surface of official religion. This is where the myth gains its atmosphere, not from evidence of blood, but from the long afterlife of symbols. The Templars supply secrecy. Egypt supplies antiquity. Osiris supplies resurrection. The Temple Mount supplies sacred geography. Relic culture supplies the idea of holy matter preserved through danger. When arranged together, these fragments create a pattern that feels almost inevitable. But inevitability is a feeling, not a document. A careful investigator has to ask what each fragment can actually bear. Templar secrecy can support the claim that outsiders did not know everything about the order. It cannot support, by itself, a hidden Osirian descent. Crusader contact with Egypt can support the claim that the Templars lived near a world shaped by older civilizations. It cannot prove they inherited the sacred kingship of those civilizations. Egyptian divine kingship can explain why Osiris and Horus became powerful symbols of lineage. It cannot place their lineage inside a Christian military order. Relic culture can explain why medieval people valued holy physical traces. It cannot transform every hidden object into sacred genetics. Occult reinterpretation can explain why later writers connected Egypt and the Templars. It cannot prove the connection was medieval. This is the central pattern of the entire legend. Real fragments are asked to do more work than they can do. And yet, those fragments should not be mocked. They are the reason the myth survived. A story built from nothing usually collapses quickly. A story built from suggestive pieces can last for centuries, because every piece gives the believer something to point toward. There was secrecy. There was Egypt. There was sacred kingship. There were relics. There was later occult symbolism. All true, in their own ways. But the conclusion does not automatically follow. This is where historical caution can feel disappointing. It refuses the grand leap. It asks for the bridge. It wants the document, the inscription, the genealogy, the contemporary testimony. It does not allow atmosphere to stand in for evidence, even when the atmosphere is magnificent. But that caution is not the enemy of mystery. It protects mystery from becoming fraud. When we keep the fragments in their proper place, the story becomes richer, not poorer. We can see how a legend is assembled. We can see how la terre ocean works with real materials. We can see how history, myth, and desire braid together until the seam is hard to find. The Osirian Templar theory borrows from history the way a dream borrows from waking life. A face glimpsed once, a place half remembered, a fear, a symbol, a door that may never have opened. The dream rearranges them into something meaningful, perhaps even beautiful. But when morning comes, the arrangement must be understood for what it is. Not a map, not a confession, not a blood record. A construction made from pieces that once belonged to other truths. And that may be the most honest way to approach the myth. It is not pure invention, and it is not proven history. It is a symbolic machine powered by genuine fragments. Its error is not that it sees connections. Its error is that it mistakes connection for dissent. History gave it the stones. Later imagination built the temple. Chapter 14. What the myth cannot prove. Now we reach the part of the story where the pattern must be tested. Not admired. Tested. Because by this point, the legend has gathered many attractive materials around itself. Osiris gives it sacred depth. Egypt gives it antiquity. The Templars give it secrecy. The Temple Mount gives it a charged setting. Relic culture gives it a medieval appetite for holy matter. Later occultism gives it atmosphere, ritual language, and the feeling of forbidden continuity. It is easy to see why the theory appeals, but appeal is not evidence. The central claim is very specific, that an Egyptian divine bloodline connected in some way to Osiris was discovered, protected, preserved, or carried by the Knights Templar. That claim requires proof of a specific kind. It would need a reliable chain between ancient Egyptian sacred kingship and medieval Templar custody. It would need documents, inscriptions, genealogies, contemporary testimony, or archaeological material strong enough to show more than symbolic resemblance. It would need evidence that the Templars themselves knew of this lineage, valued it, protected it, and treated it as part of their mission. The myth does not provide that. What it provides is association, and association is not enough. This is where many secret histories become slippery. They begin by placing two things near each other, then behave as if nearness has already proven relationship. The Templars operated in the Eastern Mediterranean. Egypt was nearby. Egypt was ancient. Osiris was connected to kingship and resurrection. The Templars were secretive and later accused of hidden practices. Therefore, the story suggests some deeper connection must have existed. But the word "therefore" is doing too much work. Symbolic resemblance is not lineage. Contact is not inheritance. Silence is not confirmation. A compelling pattern is not the same as a documented past. The difference may feel cold, but it is essential. Without it, almost anything can be made to prove almost anything else. A red cross can become a solar symbol. A fortress can become a mystery school. A pilgrimage route can become a coded map. A missing document can become proof of suppression. The theory becomes impossible to disprove because every weakness is reinterpreted as part of the secret. That is not investigation. That is belief protecting itself. A careful investigation has to allow evidence to say no. And here, the evidence says no more often than the legend wants to admit. It does not say the Templars had no secrets at all. Institutions always have inner lives. It does not say medieval Europe had no interest in ancestry, relics, sacred authority, or the East. It certainly does not say Osiris was unimportant. Osiris was one of the most enduring religious figures of the ancient world. What it says is narrower and more decisive. None of those facts proves an Osirian bloodline preserved by the Templars. There is also a problem of category. Osiris belongs first to mythology and religion, not to a traceable historical family in the ordinary sense. Egyptian kingship used divine language, sacred roles, and ritual identification. The pharaoh could stand in relation to Horus and Osiris within a religious structure, but turning that structure into a hidden genetic line that survives intact for millennia requires a leap that the evidence does not support. The legend treats divine kingship as if it were a biological password. Ancient religion was not that simple. A pharaoh's sacred role cannot be reduced to secret blood. A god's mythic sonship cannot be treated like a private genealogy. A ritual pattern of death and renewal does not automatically produce descendants waiting to be smuggled into medieval history. The same problem appears with the Templars. They were a Christian military order, not an empty vessel waiting for any ancient mystery to be poured into them. They had a rule, a mission, a church context, a political role, and a documented institutional life. Later writers may reinterpret them as initiates of Egyptian wisdom, but reinterpretation after the fact cannot replace evidence from the time. This does not mean every later symbolic reading is worthless. A symbolic reading can be meaningful. It can show how people connect traditions. It can reveal how myths are reused. It can illuminate why Osiris and the Templars became linked in imagination. But symbolic meaning must not disguise itself as proof. There is a profound difference between saying, the Templars came to symbolize hidden continuity, much as Osiris symbolized survival after death, and saying, the Templars literally preserved the blood of Osiris. The first is interpretation. The second is a historical claim, and historical claims have to answer to evidence. The myth also relies heavily on the prestige of the hidden. It assumes that what is concealed is more truthful than what is visible. Official records become suspicious simply because they are official. Ordinary explanations become boring simply because they are ordinary. The lack of proof becomes exciting because the theory has already taught us to expect concealment. But the hidden is not always deeper. Sometimes what is hidden is absent. Sometimes what is visible is enough. The documented Templars are already fascinating without adding an Egyptian bloodline. They were born from crusade, shaped by monastic discipline, drawn into war and finance, elevated by privilege, feared by rivals, and destroyed in a storm of power and accusation. Their real story does not need Osiris in order to matter. Likewise, Osiris does not need the Templars in order to endure. His myth survived through Egyptian religion, funerary imagination, royal ideology, and later symbolic reinterpretation. He was not waiting for medieval knights to make him significant. The bloodline theory tries to make both stories grander by joining them, but in doing so, it risks making both less clear. It turns Egyptian sacred kingship into a puzzle clue. It turns the Templars into props in someone else's mystery. It turns symbolic survival into biological secrecy. And perhaps most importantly, it turns the absence of evidence into a kind of sacred fog. That fog can be beautiful, but history cannot be built out of fog. If we are honest, the theory cannot prove its central claim. It cannot prove descent. It cannot prove custody. It cannot prove discovery. It cannot prove that the Templars understood themselves as guardians of an Osirian inheritance. What it can prove, unintentionally, is something else. It proves how hungry later imagination became for a secret chain connecting the ancient world to the medieval and the modern. It proves how easily symbols of death and rebirth can be transformed into claims of blood. It proves that when an order dies dramatically and a god survives mythically, people will try to make them part of the same hidden story. That is not the bloodline of Osiris. It is the bloodline of legend itself. And unlike the theory, that lineage can actually be traced from sacred kingship to medieval memory, to occult reinvention, to modern fascination with secrets that seem just out of reach. Chapter 15. The bloodline that was never blood. Perhaps the hidden Egyptian bloodline was never really about blood. Perhaps that was only the form the legend chose because blood is the most persuasive language inheritance has. Blood sounds older than paper, older than law, older than memory. It suggests a truth carried secretly beneath names, borders, religions, and political defeat. A document can be forged. A relic can be stolen. A temple can fall. But blood, in the imagination, feels stubborn. It moves quietly through time, hidden in plain sight. That is why the legend reaches for it. Not because the evidence leads there, because the longing does. By now, the central claim has lost much of its historical weight. There is no secure proof that the Templars preserved a literal line of descent from Osiris. The symbolic parallels are striking, but they do not become genealogy simply by being arranged beautifully. Egypt's sacred kingship, the myth of Osiris, the Templars' secrecy, and the later occult fascination with hidden wisdom all contribute to the legend's power. None of them proves its blood. So what remains? A different kind of lineage. Not a lineage of bodies, but of symbols. Osiris survives as the murdered king, who becomes more powerful after death. The Templars survive as the destroyed order that becomes more mysterious after dissolution. Egypt survives in Western imagination as the ancient source, the deep past, the civilization that seems to stand behind civilization. The Temple Mount survives as a place where sacred memory gathers so densely that every stone seems capable of becoming a clue. These are not ancestors in the biological sense. They are ancestors of meaning, and meanings can travel in ways blood cannot. They can cross into enemy cultures. They can be misunderstood and still remain powerful. They can be translated badly, romanticized, dressed in new rituals, used by sincere seekers and careless fantasists alike. They can be buried in books, revived in art, distorted in secret societies, and returned again in late-night documentaries, watched by people very far from the Nile or Jerusalem. That may be the real bloodline beneath the cross, a symbolic bloodline, a current of images and fears passing from one age to another. The fear that sacred things can be destroyed. The hope that they cannot be destroyed completely. The suspicion that official history has missed the deepest pattern. The desire to believe that someone, somewhere, kept the old knowledge safe. Seen this way, the myth becomes less a failed historical claim and more a record of human need. It tells us that people do not only want to know what happened, they want to believe that what happened had a hidden order. They want ruin to contain preservation. They want catastrophe to contain inheritance. Osiris gives that desire a sacred shape. His body is broken, but the story does not end with brokenness. Something is gathered. Something is transformed. Something continues, though not in the same form as before. That is why his myth can be borrowed so easily by later traditions. It is not only Egyptian in its emotional force. It speaks to a universal wound, the knowledge that everything we love can be scattered. The Templars give the desire a historical costume. They were real enough to anchor the fantasy, but ruined enough to invite projection. Their fall created the perfect imaginative wound. An order once powerful, then suddenly condemned and dissolved, becomes almost impossible for later centuries to leave alone. People look at such an ending and instinctively search for what might have escaped. Treasure, archives, rights, descendants. A secret too dangerous to survive in public. Bloodline myths thrive in that search. They turn institutional death into hidden survival. They assure us that the visible ending was never the true ending. And in a world where so many endings are final, that assurance can feel almost merciful. But mercy is not evidence. The more honest reading is also more subtle. The Templars did not carry Osiris in their veins. Later imagination carried Osiris into the Templar story because both figures had become symbols of interrupted sacred power. The connection is poetic before it is historical. It belongs to metaphor before it belongs to archive. And metaphor has its own kind of truth, not the kind that proves who descended from whom, the kind that reveals how people think when history wounds them. A literal bloodline would reduce the mystery to a hidden family tree. It would make the whole story depend on names, marriages, births, and secret preservation across an impossible span. But a symbolic bloodline opens something wider. It shows how civilizations inherit not only genes, but patterns of meaning. It shows how myths survive by changing vessels. A god becomes a story becomes a symbol becomes a theory becomes a mystery, and the mystery, if repeated long enough, begins to feel like memory. This is why the Osirian Templar legend should not be treated merely as a mistake, even though its central historical claim is unsupported. Mistakes can still reveal the shape of desire. They can show where people place their faith when official narratives feel too thin. They can expose the quiet hunger for a past that is not dead, only hidden. The bloodline that was never blood is made of those hungers. It is carried by writers, readers, initiates, skeptics, believers, and viewers who sense that history is more than a sequence of events, but less than the perfect secret pattern we sometimes wish it to be. It lives in the space between evidence and imagination, where caution and wonder must learn to share the same room. And perhaps that is where this legend finally becomes worth keeping. Not as a claim that the Templars were descendants of Osiris, not as a secret genealogy beneath Christian armor, but as a reminder that myths often survive because they answer questions history was never designed to comfort. What remains when a god dies? What remains when an order is destroyed? What remains when the sacred past is scattered beyond repair? The legend answers in the language of blood. History answers more quietly. What remains is memory, reshaped again and again until it almost seems alive. Chapter 16. Beneath Osiris's shadow, so we return, at last, to Osiris. Not as the secret ancestor of the Templars, not as the hidden father of a medieval brotherhood, not as a bloodline waiting beneath the cross, but as something older and perhaps more durable, a memory of sacred survival. Osiris endures because his story knows what loss feels like. It does not pretend that the king was never murdered, that the body was never broken, that the world was never thrown out of order. The myth begins by admitting catastrophe. Only then does it ask whether anything can be gathered from what remains. That is why the figure of Osiris could travel so far beyond ancient Egypt. Later ages saw in him a shape they recognized, authority shattered, meaning scattered. Death answered not by simple reversal, but by transformation. He does not return as he was. He becomes lord of another realm. His power survives by changing form. The Templars, in a very different way, followed a similar path in memory. Their order was destroyed. Their official life ended. Their properties were seized or transferred. Their leaders died. Their name should have become a closed chapter in the long, brutal politics of medieval Christendom. Instead, the Templars became larger after death. They became symbols of secrecy, betrayal, discipline, lost knowledge, and unfinished history. Some of that afterlife was thoughtful. Much of it was wildly embroidered, but all of it points to the same human instinct. When something powerful vanishes too suddenly, people search for what might have survived. The Osirian bloodline legend is one answer to that search. It says the ancient sacred did not die. It passed into hiding. It says Egypt did not become a memory. It became an inheritance. It says the Templars were not merely crusader monks. They were guardians of something older than their own faith. But the evidence will not carry that claim. There is no reliable proof that the Knights Templar discovered, protected, or descended from a surviving line of Osiris. The theory depends on symbols, later interpretations, suggestive geography, and the seductive force of absence. It asks atmosphere to do the work of documentation, and atmosphere, however powerful, is not enough. Still, dismissing the legend as only false would be too simple. It is false as genealogy, but it is revealing as myth. It reveals how people build secret bridges across broken history. It reveals how Egypt became, for later imagination, the great storehouse of origins. It reveals how the Templars became a vessel into which almost any hidden tradition could be poured. And it reveals how deeply we want the sacred past to survive not merely in books or ruins, but in some living form that cannot be erased. Perhaps that is the true shadow of Osiris over this story. Not blood. Continuity. The hope that what is dismembered can still be gathered. The hope that what is condemned can still be remembered. The hope that beneath the violence of history, something ancient remains intact enough to speak. But careful history gives us a quieter answer. It tells us that survival does not always require a secret dynasty. Sometimes a god survives in ritual memory, in art, in translation, in misinterpretation, in scholarship, in symbols that are borrowed and changed. Sometimes an order survives not through descendants, but through the questions people keep asking after its destruction. The Templars were not the sons of Osiris, but both Osiris and the Templars became vessels for the same longing. The belief that death is not always the end of meaning. And maybe that is why the legend continues to breathe. Because somewhere between the Nile and Jerusalem, between temple myth and crusader ruin, between evidence and desire, we find a truth more human than the bloodline itself. We do not only preserve the past because it happened. We preserve it because we need it to remain alive.